Today on Locked On Canadiens, I'm going to take a look at some NHL buyers and sellers, talk about how it's going to affect the Habs, and then will CHL players be allowed to play in the NCAA? All that's coming up on today's episode.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1006. As you know, we're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day, and we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. My name is Laura Sab, also known as The Active Stick, and I'm not joined today by Scott Batla of Habs Eyes on the Prize. He's just taking the night off. Everything's fine. But today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. All right, let's get into today's show. I think what I want to do is I do want to talk about the CHL players and the potential that they might be allowed to play in the NCAA. That's certainly where it looks like things are headed. But I wanted to recap a little bit the buyers and the sellers in the NHL and I'm going through some notes and things like that, and talk about how this will affect the Habs. So I think a team that to me is confirmed to be a buyer is probably a team that's headed towards the playoffs, is expected to make at least some noise in it, if not a fully deep run, and also might be missing a piece or two. So I kind of want to talk, is there any potential that someone on the Habs might appeal to these teams? And this division is kind of tricky because the Atlantic Division right now at the top has Boston, Florida, and Tampa Bay. And then Toronto's in the wild card spot, and we're going to get to Detroit in a second. And obviously, division rivals are extremely tricky because you don't want to trade with them. Although in the past we've seen that, there's been trades with Florida, Tampa, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that the Canadiens necessarily will be looking to help their rivals all that much, but at the same time, this is a new management, and it doesn't really affect them today, right? Like if both teams were headed towards the playoffs or they were on the cusp or, I think it would look very, very different. The picture would look very different. From my perspective, honestly, the Bruins look fine. They don't need anybody, and they also don't really have any prospects that the Canadiens might be able to trade for. And that's something definitely like a division rival wouldn't do, is help you in terms of prospects, right? So I'm trying to think about as well, from what I remember, they don't really have all that many picks to trade either. So I feel like in terms of the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens, not just for rivalry reasons, but also for logistical and practical reasons, there's no trade to be made there, I don't think. And then the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think just for me, I'm looking at the Leafs and there's nothing necessarily all that wrong with them per se. They're supposed to be much better. They're supposed to have won cups by now. They've got such talent on their lineup, but then they always seem to have at least one key missing piece. And even at the times that they don't, and they make trade deadline additions, like some muscle, some toughness, or whatever, it doesn't necessarily seem to work out all that well for them. And when I say that, I just mean, Toronto can't get past the first round for many, many years, and then now can't get past the second round. I personally feel like Toronto could probably want bodies, depths, just, to shore up their lineup in case of injuries if they want to go on a long playoff run. But Montreal doesn't have pieces for them. And when I say that, I mean, I'm sure that they would love somebody like a Jordan Harris or an Arbor Jacki. I'm sure they would like try and figure out in terms of the cap, because they are quite up against the cap. Those are players that would help them, but Montreal's never going to give up either player to Toronto. And when they do give up those players, it'll be for a very high price. So right now, Toronto isn't exactly in a position to give because their cupboard is looking tough right now. And then, like, in terms of the Western Conference, this one is a little bit, I would say there's a little bit more potential here. For example, like the Canucks, I feel like are a team that, given how they've done this season, they should be pulling out all the stops to try and really make some noise. There's definitely something that um, there's definitely something that they can do. There's definitely something that's within their power to kind of really push themselves over the edge. I'm just trying to think about what it would be on the Montreal Canadiens. Like, I feel like at the same time, like, I feel like Vancouver's a team that would be looking for a veteran player to add at the deadline, like maybe a rental type guy who has some playoff experience, but isn't necessarily going to play that many minutes, just more kind of play kind of like a role like the Stalls did or Corey Perry did at the time, but before we knew he was a blah blah blah. That kind of role on the team. I think that's what they might be looking for, because they made their big quote unquote splash, right? And they traded with Calgary. They traded with a, for all intents and purposes, not necessarily a division rival, but a rival. And I think they might not be done, but I also think for them, it's not like this year you do want to, like, be all in. Like, when are you going to get an opportunity like this again? But I think it's not necessarily fatal if they don't. Like, I do think that there's potential for them to be able to really excel in that particular conference for a few years to come. So, like, there might be potential down the line. I'm just trying to think, like, do any of the players that Montreal Canadiens want to trade, like a Yoel Armia, Josh Anderson, David Savard, that kind of person? And I know yesterday we talked about them not necessarily wanting to trade Savard, but it's just all over him, like, veteran guy for the playoff run. I know there's still some time left on his contract. I'm just saying he just screams like the kind of player that teams want to add at the deadline, right? Either way, I don't know that any of these people will move the needle for Vancouver. I really don't. And at the same time, there's so many players on Vancouver that I would want, but I don't think that they'd be willing to give them up. Who else is there? We talked about the Colorado Avalanche a little bit before. We said that, the players that we like on the Montreal Canadiens, we would love for them to end up on the Colorado Avalanche. That's secretly where I was hoping Sean Monahan would end up, not in Winnipeg with the coward Mark Scheifele. I'm almost forgetting how to podcast at this point. Like, I'm forgetting our own memes. I just I would have wanted him to end up there, but like, I think Colorado is really smart, and they can take somebody who is on, let's call it, an inefficient contract, and really bring out the best and the necessary in him. Like, I feel like with Colorado, it doesn't make sense for them to pick up a Yoel Armia, but if they did, they would make a Stanley Cup winner out of him, if that makes sense. And I also, I don't think that they have all that much use for very many other Montreal Canadiens players. Unfortunately, the kind of player that would definitely fit in that lineup is Jordan Harris. And again, the Canadiens are not currently going to give them up, and not right now. So I do think that they are kind of like, they also like being a really good team. Sometimes it's really rough to get return from them. But I do think I think they would love forward depth. I also feel like that's also like, if the Canadians aren't going to use Jesse Yulin to his top potential and only play him very limited minutes and not give him those prime opportunities where he can be effective, that's somewhere he can end up. And like, Colorado would really be able to um, bring out his prime, I think. Like that to me, and again, I'm making them sound like a magical team. It's not. I really like the way that they do things, and I really hope the Habs emulate that quote unquote rebuild. They've got they've got potential to be, perennial Stanley Cup contenders for the next few years. And I really want to see some of these players that I like on the Habs end up there. But again, like that's just me. And that's just also because I really like the way it worked out with Arturi Lehkonen in the past. In the meantime, there's still a couple of other teams that I wanted to talk about before we get to our segment on CHL players and whether or not they would be or will eventually be allowed to play in the NCAA. I'll explain all of that and the implications a little bit later here on Locked On Canadiens. But first, this episode is brought to you by Indeed. When you're hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search for a candidate at all. What you need to do is match. Enter Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching search engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. You can use Indeed to schedule, screen, message all these applicants, and you'll connect with candidates faster. And it doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers high quality matches compared to other job sites. Honestly, like from my perspective, hiring is hard. It really, really, really is. And you really need a good partner in that. And Indeed is so good for that. If you're looking to hire right now, listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this. Now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. All right, let's get back to the buyers and the sellers at the trade deadline. Well, I haven't really talked about any sellers, but really, like, I did want to talk about one team, and we'll get to that in a second after we talk about some other potential buyers. Let's talk about Florida a little bit. I think Florida's kind of learned their lesson, and they're not going to be trading with the Habs anytime soon. They got they gave up too much for Ben Sherratt, but then they ended up winning that trade anyway, by making it to the Stanley Cup Finals and then allowing Vegas to win. And I don't necessarily I don't see a match there. Tampa Bay is really funny because people keep joking about sending David Savard back there. I don't think that they'll do that, but how funny would that be? Like Tampa does not have the space/room. I just think it's really funny though that they're still in the playoff conversation. They were so good for so long without winning, and then they won, and then they were constantly in the finals, and yes, obviously they did commit the unforgivable sin with Toronto last year, but at the end of the day, like the fact that they're still in the conversation is so impressive, and I want the Canadiens to kind of do that, but without being hateable, just more kind of like the Colorado Avalanche and being likable. So I don't necessarily see anything there, but I people keep bringing that up. I also think that if you want to trade to one of these teams, you do have to retain salary, and I don't necessarily think there's any appetite for that. Not with respect to Josh Anderson, not with respect to Yoel Armia, not with respect, especially not with respect to David Savard. And finally, I wanted to talk about the Oilers a little bit because they still feel like a hot mess, even though they have the chance to win it all if they would just make a few smart moves. And from my perspective, they could get a, you know, The Habs have a glut of defensemen. They've also got like depth forwards. They don't have elite forwards, but they have depth forwards that they could trade. And and some goaltending. I'd be willing to say that they would still call about like goaltending is going to be their issue for a few years, and I think that they would still be willing to call the Habs on that, or on a goalie, I should say. I do kind of want to go back a little bit to something that we talked about yesterday, where Scott and I were talking about the trade deadline and how we expected the Habs to mostly stay put. Like we weren't expecting big moves or anything like that. And Scott also did a little bit of a deeper dive on Jake Allen a couple of days ago in a previous episode and talked about whether or not this could be it for him. And one thing that we talked about was there's only a few games left before the trade deadline, and the Habs really do kind of need to play Caden Primo and Jake Allen as much as possible. Not just because they need to be showcased and the Habs need to see what they've got and kind of make a decision with Caden Primo, but also because of the tank. Oh, a number of you have commented that Samuel Montembeault has cost the Canadiens now 2 years in a row top 5 pick. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a lot more nuance than that, but I think the Habs kind of need to play the other two goalies a little bit just until the trade deadline, just to see if there's anything there. There might not be, right? Like teams might not be interested. There might not be a market for them, but just in case, like now's the time to play them leading up to the trade deadline. There's a bunch of games coming up in a row. There's a little bit of a tightly packed schedule coming up. And I just would like to see them make some moves on that front. In the meantime, I don't necessarily think they're going to be trading for anybody. We talk a lot about the need for bodies on this team, like decimated by injuries. There needs to be forward depth, blah, blah, blah. I just think that if they're going to pick anyone up, it's going to be either like a tryout or an AHL guy for an AHL guy. Maybe bring somebody up just to kind of exist on this team for the home stretch before the end of the season. So again, like this is a list of essentially potential teams that might have interest in Habs players. And as you can tell, there's not a whole lot of meat there. So if the Canadians do kind of stand pat at the trade deadline, I really, really want to make sure we're not all disappointed, just because if you look at the market, it's not necessarily their year. Yes, they should be pulling out all those stops and trying to get as many draft picks as possible. But as Scott pointed out yesterday, the draft might be where it's at in terms of trades. Like that does seem to be around when Kent Hughes is most active. And we've seen that in the last 2 years that he was GM. In his third year, there's no reason to expect that he would deviate from that. That also gives players like Josh Anderson a couple of months to kind of get it together and look better. That's all I want for Josh Anderson, to get it together and look better, and then find a home for him where he'll be happy and the Habs will be happy, and all of you guys will be happy as well. All right, so I want to turn my attention to the CHL and the NCAA, and that's all coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. But first, this episode is brought to you by Gametime. How many times have you been frustrated by the idea of trying to buy tickets and then you can't find tickets, or when you do find them, they're not good, you don't know where they are, you're worried about the hidden fees, all of that kind of stuff? Well, I'm here to tell you that Gametime eliminates all of that for you, because Gametime is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind whenever you purchase. You can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And all your prices, they show the total upfront. There's never hidden fees, and you know you're getting a great deal before you hit checkout. And you can buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. I mean, why not? This is a no-brainer. And they have deals on tickets right up to the start of the event and even an hour after it starts. Really, the last-minute seats, that's where you're going to find them. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's talk about the CHL and the NCAA. So this is actually news that came out, I believe, over the weekend or on Monday. So it is a few days old, but I wanted some time to research and kind of figure out what the implications were. Essentially, this was reported by Elliot Friedman to start, and I believe Jeff Merrick elaborated on it later. And essentially, here's what's going to happen. There's a potential, or according to Elliot Friedman, it's happening. It's on the way. We just don't know how far away it is that the NCAA might allow CHL players to play. So, what's the background on this? Like in today's world, the current state is that any player who plays in any CHL league or signs a contract with any CHL team is deemed ineligible to play in the NCAA. Why? Because the NCAA insists on players being amateurs and not professionals. So, because the CHL leagues will have players that have signed contracts, like professional contracts at all, essentially everybody can't play in the NCAA. Like it's considered like a potential for a professional to be playing. But the NCAA, like also the fact that they want you to be amateurs and not professionals, like for the longest time, it meant that players could not make any money off of their names, their likeness, like merch, anything like that, in order to remain eligible to play in the NCAA. Like you could not capitalize on your own personal brand. And stay eligible. But in recent years, they've become a little bit more lenient about that. And that, like, there's a lot of complexities to the rule, but essentially, in as of June 2021, this is like an interim rule at this point, but like functionally, any college player can now monetize their own brand. Like you can do that, which you didn't used to be able to in like prior to June 2020. It was a huge thing. Like these players were playing and they could not make any money off of it. And some players could be worth millions, right? Like even at that age. So with the relaxation of those rules, like there's also a possibility that NCAA could vote to allow CHL players to become eligible to play in the NCAA. And like I said, Elliot Friedman seems to think we are headed that way. It's just a matter of when. So it could be anytime soon, or even if they vote right now, it might not, it might take a few years for it to take effect. But this is going to change a lot of things. So essentially, it right now, younger players are kind of locked into going one route or the other. So you kind of have to choose, like before you should have to choose anything, if you're going to go the CHL route or you're going to try and get into college and play in the NCAA. And you have to figure out what is, your best path. And a lot of times like players that young might not know, and they might learn after actually playing in the CHL that the NCAA might have been a better route for them. They would never have been able to change their minds, but this is going to open it up for them. And the other thing that it could do is it could essentially this is going to benefit the players. Like there's no question about that. Like players are going to have more choices. But what it could do is it could harm like Canadian university sports because a lot of CHL players not being eligible for the NCAA will opt for Canadian universities. Um, and it also, I think, at the end of the day, like I do think that it could mean for, even the NHL, like a lot of their players can, or a lot of their draft picks can play in the CHL, decide they want to pursue an education for a while, and it could take longer for them to come over and play in the NHL. Like there's that a lot of times as well. There are players right now that uh, once they're through their CHL contracts or their CHL experience, once they've outgrown that experience, I should say, right now they're going to the AHL team. And there's a chance that they might delay that as well or bypass it entirely and go to the NCAA and then come directly to the NHL from there. So it does kind of change the picture for NHL teams in one way, but it mostly affects the players. And I think, like from my perspective, anything that gives players more control over their futures, because you have to remember, like once you're drafted, or even until you're drafted, like your entire life belongs to someone else, right? You spend all this time trying to get drafted by an NHL team and you do everything to try and get that done. And then once you're drafted by the NHL team, your rights are owned by them. Like you do not have autonomy. You do not have control over your future. So giving them that little bit of control is going to be incredible. And it also, I think it might also really change the quality of NCAA hockey, and it might generate more interest in it, right? Like, like college football and college basketball is huge. College hockey is huge in only hockey circles, right? This could really change the game for them. It could really make them a little bit more prominent, and it will give players the opportunity to monetize their own brand as well. Like I think that like that's a huge opportunity. So I do feel that there are going to be some stakeholders that are going to be left behind in all of this, and I do think that that's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, like, this seems like it's huge news. It's massive for players, it's massive for draft experts, and we will actually be asking a draft expert to comment on this, coming very, very soon. Scott and I are trying to line up some fun guests for the next little while, just to give you guys, some fun things to listen to. So please stay tuned and please subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians, and you can find me on Twitter at The Active Stick or any social media at The Active Stick. And Scott can be found at Scott Matla. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time.